Lesson 5 for week of January 30th, 2022 Countercultural Compassion. Background passage. Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 10 through 21 lesson passage. Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 10 through 21. Unifying topic: justice and the marginalized. We have two lesson texts. The first lesson text: justice respects dignity and worth. Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 10 through 15. The second lesson text: justice does not discriminate. Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 16 through 21. The main thought: but thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee thence. Therefore I command thee to do this thing. Deuteronomy chapter 24 verse 18, King James Version. Unifying principle: some people are poor and marginalized. How can their dignity and worth be respected? Deuteronomy demands justice for all who are poor or marginalized. Lesson aim: the poor and needy should not be assumed to be lazy or incompetent. The people of God are called to help victims of oppression and circumstances. Life aims to not discriminate against those who are different from us. To work to help to meet the needs of those who are suffering because of injustices in our society. Teaching steps. First step: invite the class to talk about their feelings of obligation to meet the needs of the poor and needy in the church and in the community. Second step: read aloud the key verse. Ask class members if this verse applies to their own lives. Some class members may consider themselves as poor and in need. Third step: inquire if class members believe that being a member in certain groups means discrimination. How so? Fourth step: debate whether Christians are obligated to assist the poor and needy, or if in today's society the responsibility belongs to the government. Fifth step: gleaning was a means for showing recognition of the dignity of the poor. Discuss what students can do to show they recognize the dignity of everyone. God's Word in Life. Check cashing payday loan stores are all across the nation. There are many brands and colors, but they all work around the same basic model. They offer check cashing services and short-term loans for people who in many cases would otherwise not have access to these services. Their customers do not have bank accounts and thus do not have direct deposit available nor the ability to cash their checks at their home bank. In most instances, they charge a percentage fee to cash a check. They also offer small loans that most people use for emergencies. However, these loans are offered at extremely high interest rates that many consider to be exorbitant. Collateral is also needed to secure a loan. In cases of default, a lien can be placed on an automobile or house. We should consider how these practices interact with the scripture for today. It seems that under the rubric for economic justice within Israelite society, our practices would be condemned as unjust. If we consider that these stores are almost exclusively set up in low-income neighborhoods, these should help as a rallying call to see God's economic justice take place in our communities. We should ask whether or not God is pleased with this kind of exploitation of the poor. If we are honest with ourselves, it is easy to see that based on the law given by God, He does not desire for us to continue in these practices. Introduction. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, Moses continued to set forth regulations that were to be the principles the people lived by in the new land. The Israelites were a holy people chosen by God to be His own possession. God chose them, but their elevated status with the Lord did not give them the right to discriminate. God called His people to be a caring community that regarded the dignity of others as more important than the acquisition of wealth. The people were not to take advantage of those in need, that included the fatherless, widows, and orphans, whether they were Israelites or aliens. Instead, they were to be treated with justice. By giving justice to those who were in need, they would indicate that the God of Israel had shown them mercy. The first lesson text: Justice respects dignity and worth. Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 10 through 15. King James Version. Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 10 through 15. 10 When thou dost lend thy brother anything, thou shalt not go into his house to fetch his pledge. 11 Thou shalt stand abroad, and the man to whom thou dost lend shall bring out the pledge abroad unto thee. 12 And if the man be poor, thou shalt not sleep with his pledge. 13 In any case thou shalt deliver him the pledge again when the sun goeth down, that he may sleep in his own raiment, and bless thee, and it shall be righteousness unto thee before the Lord thy God. 14 Thou shalt not oppress an hired servant that is poor and needy, whether he be of thy brethren, or of thy strangers that are in thy land within thy gates. 15 At his day thou shalt give him his hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it, for he is poor, and setteth his heart upon it, lest he cry against thee unto the Lord, and it be sin unto thee. Our lesson passage began by telling the Israelites they were allowed to make loans. They were allowed to receive a pledge or collateral, but the pledge was not to be demanded by the one making the loan. The pledge was to be offered voluntarily by the one receiving the loan. In many situations, the person making the loan thought they could determine what the pledge should be. They thought they could go into the house to see what the borrower had in their house. They could determine what item should be sufficient collateral for the loan. In order to prevent this procedure, the law required the person making the loan to stay outside and allow the borrower to determine what they had to offer. A poor person could be embarrassed and feel ashamed if their space was invaded and their privacy rights were ignored and violated. This procedure would prevent the person making the loan from taking an item that was valuable to the borrower. If this procedure was followed, the dignity of the borrower would be respected. The law also required that the needs of the borrower would not be omitted when a loan was being made. The person making the loan could not choose the pledge item for their own purpose. This practice was to be avoided because the pledge item might be something the person really needed. A garment given as a pledge might be needed to keep warm at night. In such cases, the pledge was to be received symbolically. At the end of the day, the pledge was to be returned. The borrower would bless the one making the loan, and the Lord would bless them. Jesus confirmed this principle when he said that in the judgment those who had assisted those in need would be accepted into the kingdom. Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Matthew chapter 25 verse 40 NRSV version. The worth of a person was to be regarded. This regulation applied to both Israelites and aliens. A worker was to be paid at sunset because the worker agreed to work because they had no money reserved. The poor would be depending on their pay at the end of the day so the needs of his family could be met. In today's world, there are places where one can work for daily pay. Often those who work for daily pay are in transient situations and need immediate money to provide for daily needs. This is why God makes provision for them through this law. The second lesson text: Justice does not discriminate. Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 16 through 21. King James Version. Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 16 through 21. 16 The fathers shall not be put to death for the children, Neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. 17 Thou shalt not pervert the judgment of the stranger, nor of the fatherless, nor take a widow's raiment to pledge. 18 But thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee thence. Therefore I command thee to do this thing. 19 When thou cuttest down thine harvest in thy field, and hast forgot a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go again to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hands. 20 When thou beatest thine olive tree, thou shalt not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. 21 When thou gatherest the grapes of thy vineyard, thou shalt not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. God holds every person accountable for his/her own sins. The regulation in Deuteronomy chapter 24 verse 16 served to clarify the belief that guilt affected an entire social group, especially the family. This was a spurious interpretation of the second commandment that stated God would visit the iniquity of the father to the children. Exodus chapter 20 verses 5 through 6. Although the entire community could suffer in solidarity of guilt. Deuteronomy chapter 21 verses 1 through 9. This law gave priority to the principle of individual responsibility. Jeremiah chapter 31 verse 29. Ezekiel chapter 18 verses 2 through 4. Typically, the poor and the weak are deprived of justice. God said the poor and the weak were not to be taken advantage of. 3 groups were named: the resident alien, orphans, and widow. We might think of them as protected classes given their easy exposure to possible exploitation. They were to be given equal treatment under the law. The law given here was given to prevent different standards of justice for different groups of people. The Israelites were to remember they were helpless slaves in Egypt, discriminated against and deprived of justice because they were not considered of equal worth as the Egyptians. The Israelites were to have great compassion for the poorest and the weakest. God's people were instructed to make special provisions for those who had just been mentioned. Farmers were instructed to leave some of their harvest to provide for the 3 groups. When harvesting the field, the workers were not to take particular care to gather every bundle, sheaf, of the grain. They were to occasionally leave some portions for the poor to collect. The same principle applied for the collection of olives and grapes in the vineyard. By leaving some of the harvest, the attentive Israelite could demonstrate he cared about the dignity of everyone. Instead of having to resort to begging, the poor could work to provide for their own needs. This was a God-ordained safety net to ensure no one in Israel would not have enough to survive. Conclusion: God's justice was front and center for the Israelites. He desired his people to live in his righteousness that is so much more than simple morality and eschewing vices. Justice was to apply to all members of the community according to his/her own deeds. That was good news for them and also for us. We are not to be judged according to the sins of those who came before us. Each one of us should be taken on our own merit and not that of another. God looks upon us as individuals, and we should do the same to those we encounter on a daily basis. Beyond judgment, justice requires that all are provided for. Biblical justice calls for there to be enough for everyone, even the poor.